2003, Sega joined forces with D3 Publisher to form a new development studio called 3D Ages. Its purpose was to remake many of Sega's classic IPs into modern polygonal variants. This new line of Japanese exclusive software would be known as the Sega Ages 2500 series, named for the cost of each and every entry at just 2,500 yen, or about half the cost of a regular title. This series of games ran from 2003 to 2008 on Sony's PlayStation 2, spanning some 33 volumes and including such classics as Phantasy Star, Golden Axe, Virtua Fighter 2, Panzer Dragoon, and many more. It started out as 3D polygon remakes of 2D games, but ultimately began to include compilation-style releases and remasters of games that were already made of polygons. While Sega mostly ignored bringing these games to any other region, the US and Europe did receive a compilation of some of them in 2005 under the Sega Classics Collection label. It included 9 volumes of the Japanese series. You got Monaco GP, Fantasy Zone, Space Harrier, Golden Axe, Puzzle and Action Tant-R to Bonanza Brothers, Columns, Virtua Racing, Outrun, and Alien Syndrome. To put it mildly, this release was not well received. Magazines and websites blasted it as pointless garbage that would interest no one. Some called it the worst compilation ever released. The question is, were these games treated unfairly, or were they really as bad as everyone said? In this episode, we're going to take a look at Sega Classics Collection, have a look at each and every entry, and find out if all that bad press was deserved, or if maybe there are a few hidden gems in there. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Sega Classics Collection for the PlayStation 2. The first game on the list is Alien Syndrome. The original arcade version was an overhead run-and-gun inspired heavily by the Aliens movie franchise. In the remake here, it's been turned into a modern twin-stick shoot-'em-up with greatly enhanced gameplay. You can now move and shoot in any direction simultaneously, increasing your ability to defend yourself incredibly. The setup is mainly the same from there. You get different weapons to choose from, optional satellites to help defend you, and you must still rescue the crew before the timer runs out. Once you do that, you fight a boss, usually some hideous deformity that fills the screen. The visuals are of course polygonal now, and while not particularly impressive, they do get the job done. The developers were wise to not stray too far from the original game, and adding twin-stick control really does improve the experience quite a bit. It's a simple thing, but the way enemies are constantly thrown at you, it makes all the difference in the world. The boss encounters are something else too. Large, truly imposing beasts fill the screen while you run for your life the entire time. I feel this one is quite good and an overall solid remake. It also has a killer soundtrack that feels like it was lifted straight out of a big-budget Hollywood film. It's an excellent start for this collection, and very much worth a play. Sadly, Sega wanted the rating in Europe to stay accessible to kids, so they cut this one from that region's collection entirely. Columns is the type of game you really don't expect a lot from. It's a simple premise and rarely does Sega attempt to change much about it. This bare-bones edition is less a remake and more a retread, and it's a poor addition to this collection. Right off the bat, it doesn't include any form of flash columns, and the main versus mode has a ho-hum story attached that does little to help the boredom. Essentially, it's just an endless falling of jewels to be matched, and it quickly gets stale. Without any new puzzle elements or additional gameplay tweaks, it's the same game it always was, but without any of the advancements of the later titles in the series. It does have a pretty damn good soundtrack, but otherwise this is one game in the collection you likely won't be firing up very often. I always did enjoy Sega's Fantasy Zone series, and I think the remake here is a fine twist on the original arcade. The new cel-shaded visuals replicate the look and feel of the source quite well without changing anything major. You still must destroy the enemy bases, collect money, and buy upgrades. The major difference here is actually the way you collect your winnings after defeating the boss of the stage. Instead of him just dropping his purse, it switches to a 3D mode that allows you to move around and collect the coins as the boss spits them out. Outside of that, it's the same great shoot 'em up it's always been. It's easy to pick up and play, challenging, and it has a great soundtrack. Some formulas are best left untouched, and I think Fantasy Zone always played well enough to not really need much in the way of change. If you didn't like it before, nothing here is going to convince you otherwise, but this is a strong addition to the collection for fans who love the arcade original. Without question, one of the games I was looking forward to the most in this collection was Golden Axe. I was a big fan of the arcade original, and the prospect of a remake definitely had an appeal. It started out so good too. That title screen music was jamming and I was ready to relive some great arcade action. But it all goes to hell the moment the character selection screen pops up. You look at these models and man, do you get a bad feeling that something has gone horribly wrong. And wrong ends up being a very polite term for just how bad this all is. The gameplay is utterly broken here. Your attacks are slow, the grapple system isn't nearly as easy to pull off, and just the simple action of jumping can be frustrating. The presentation is funky too. It looks worse than most games from the previous generation, and the variety is laughable. You fight the same few enemies for 2 entire stages before you see another new model, and not even the magic effects can save it from looking low budget and unappealing. It even has slowdown if you can believe it. Watching the once mighty Gilius Thunderhead waddle around the screen slow as molasses is depressing, and coupled with the disastrous gameplay, you are left with a remake that fails to live up to the original in nearly every way. The lone area of reprieve is the great soundtrack, but that does little to make up for its other shortcomings. There's no other way to say it. Sega shat the bed, the floor, the kitchen, the yard, and everywhere in between with this mess. Golden Axe deserved better. The original Monaco GP from Sega was an overhead racing game released in 1979. This is a remake of that classic with a new perspective and a few new tweaks to the formula. The problem is, it's still a super simple game with a lot of issues. The other racers are constantly crashing all over the track, taking away any ability to actually enjoy the game. Trying to play this one seriously is maddening. You will be going along just fine and bam, some random spinning car out of nowhere wrecks you. Again and again. After 5 minutes or so of this nonsense, you'll have enough and turn it off. Sega had numerous other games that could have been remade in place of this one. There is something to be said about going too far back when picking games to remake. In order for this one to have some appeal, they essentially needed to create an entirely new game. They didn't do that, and the result is 1979 gameplay wrapped up in a terrible presentation. Let's get this out the way right now. The car in this remake of Outrun is ugly. Dog ugly. It's too big, it's shaped wrong, and it just sticks out like a sore thumb. But I want to be clear, this is not a bad game at all. The core of what made it great to begin with translates over fairly well to the 3D engine, with mainly just the car looking like ass. The gameplay is super smooth, It has all the different routes and locations from before, and it even has some elements from some of the other versions of Outrun, like rivals and being able to race a full grid of Japanese and overseas courses. It plays just like Outrun as well. Each curve, hill, and roadside detail feels familiar despite the huge visual change. I do concede that as much as I want to argue that the gameplay merits respect, that visual change is going to put some of you off. It's not that this game is wholesale ugly, it's just that it's so different from what was before it. If you can't get past it, this one is a failure, but if you can, there is a great playing racing game here. The music is quite good as well. Much the same as Outrun, Space Harrier here suffers from some garish 3D elements that definitely detract from its appeal. Unfortunately, the fast gameplay from the original suffers as well. It takes the one element that made Space Harrier so much fun and really changes the feel of it. That's a shame because there are some notable upgrades to the gameplay. You now have a Panzer Dragoon style lock-on attack, power-ups like shields you can collect, as well as screen-clearing nuke attacks. These additions really do add some new appeal and could have been a real game changer had the gameplay not suffered in the transition. It's nowhere near as bad as Golden Axe, but purists will not take to it and newcomers will likely not find much appeal in it. It feels much slower and lower budget than it should, and some of the assets look ridiculous. The transition from 2D to 3D always has a jarring effect on older series, but I feel a better job could have been done here. Not the worst Sega Ages 2500 release, but also far, far from the best. Puzzle and Action Tant-R to Bonanza Brothers is a combo game that has slight remasters of both titles. Tant-R is a series of mini-games you compete in. It's simple stuff like matching patterns, memory games, and puzzles. It's not my kind of game, but it's here if you want to give it a go. Bonanza Brothers is the classic Sega arcade game that has you stealing various treasures from well-guarded areas. These two games did not get the 3D polygon makeover most of these other games received, making you wonder why they're here at all. Neither one looks very different from the 16 and 32-bit versions that came before, so the appeal is quite limited. Again, if you like them, they're here, but I doubt many of you will be replaying these very often. The final game in the collection is Virtua Racing FlatOut, which is an update to the AM2 Classic Racer that first appeared on the Model 1 arcade board. Since this game was already in 3D, not much needed to be done to improve things. The performance is solid, the resolution increased, the color is great, and for the most part it plays just like it should. There's even some additional content here in the way of cars and tracks, making it quite possibly the best version of the game at the time. It even uses the Logitech driving force wheel if you got it. It's easily the best entry on this disc and really the direction Sega should have taken with the Sega Ages line to begin with. Going back too far meant making big changes to the fundamentals of some of these games, while stuff like Virtua Racing needed just a slight nudge here and there to be brought up to modern spec. In essence, the less done the better, and the result is a great looking and playing version of this game that wouldn't be eclipsed until the Switch version many years later. If Sega ever revisits the Sega Ages idea, hopefully they realize that we have seen enough of the games from the 70s and 80s. It's high time for their arcade catalog from the 90s to get its chance in the spotlight. The Sega Ages 2500 line would go on to include many more games from Japan. From the mighty Panzer Dragoon to the RPG favorite Dragon Force, it had quite a lot of variety in its 33 volumes. Unfortunately, Sega Classics Collection is the only time any of these would appear in the US and Europe, which is a real shame because Sega took over the series after Volume 15 and really started to turn around the quality. I'd also like to take a moment and mention that while a few of these games are of dubious quality, it's amazing how great the music is in some of them. Seriously, there are some killer tunes in these games. Take a listen to a few selections to see what I mean. While I do admit that the off-putting visual stylings of some of these games will drive many of you away, I still had some fun with Virtua Racing, Alien Syndrome, Phantasy Zone, and Outrun. The weakest entries here were easily Monaco GP, Golden Axe, Tant-R to Bonanza Brothers, and Columns. The real head-scratcher is that Sega chose these poor additions considering better games were already out in Japan. Sega could have instead added Game Ground, Afterburner 2, and Decathlete to the mix, and they would have been far better additions all the way around. But that really has been the story of Sega Ages no matter the system it's been released on. Most of the time the game choices have been all wrong, and when Sega does get one right, it's either too late to matter or simply wasn't released outside of Japan. I think Sega could have had a great run with this line in North America if they had left behind the stinkers like Golden Axe and concentrated on the better games, but alas, it wasn't meant to be. Given the poor critical reception of this one, Sega likely shelved any plans to do another, and Sega Ages once again slipped into obscurity for many of us. I hope someday they get it right because there are an awful lot of Sega games out there just begging to be released. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.